continuation of our study of looking at the defense of our hope. Just to remind you that we are backing up to lesson 8 today, and next week will be lesson 10, which really coordinates very well because today we're going to be looking at especially Old Testament prophecies, but next week it goes into looking at the validity of Jesus, and it bases that on the fulfilled prophecies that he was part of. So they really kind of tie in together. But we are on lesson 8, and we'll be looking at several Old Testament prophecies. I'm going to begin here in a couple of minutes with a verse in Matthew chapter 24, verse 42. If you care to turn to that, I'm sure that as we get started, you'll know what that passage refers to. But before we begin, if you would please bow with me and we'll have a word of prayer. Our Father in heaven, you have blessed us so wonderfully, so many wonderful things that we have, especially this morning as we gather to worship you together as a family. We're thankful for this group and for the edification that each supplies and builds each of us up. Father, we're thankful for your word that we have to understand and learn about you and increase our faith and be able to share that with others and do so in a manner confidently. We pray that we are encouraged by our time together and study and act in such a way that honors you, Father. For in your presence we stand and worship and appreciate being your children. And it's through your Son's name we ask. Amen. I want to start off thinking about the idea of a little bit about advertising. I've talked to a couple of different business owners or contractors or people in the past, and I remember one fellow in particular, I asked him if his work came with a written warranty, because several other groups we talked with said, oh, we have this warranty and all this, and he said, no, I don't have a written warranty. He said, if something goes wrong or you're not happy with something, you call me and I will fix it. He said, if I do you a good job, if I keep my word and honor my promises, then you may tell 2 or 3 other people. And if I do a bad job, you'll probably tell a dozen people. And I can't afford that kind of advertising. And you think about that, people that you trust, that you've done business with in the past, whether salesmen or contractors or business owners, and you begin to trust them and you recommend them to friends. We've recently had neighbors move in on both sides of us from out of town, and they said, who would you trust to do this? And so they're going by my word, and I'm going by what someone else has done for me, and we do that all the time. And so a person's word and keeping their promise is a whole lot better method of advertising. And think of how many people that you've heard of, or perhaps you even know, that have fallen victim to scams or false advertising or email or phone surveys or announcements that are there basically to steal your personal information and maybe your identity, sell you a product that you never receive, or worse yet, clean out a bank account. I mean, we hear that all the time because people make promises to do someone. You show up for a doctor's call, and you're there the 15 to 30 minutes ahead of time to do all the preparation work and all of that you've already done on the phone with them, for your appointment. And then an hour later, you're still sitting in the office and haven't seen the doctor yet. When people say, we'll be there at a certain time, or you be here at a certain time, and that's your appointment, and then that doesn't happen, you start to lose trust in that situation or that business or whatever. It gets me when we have a call and someone's coming to the house and they said, well, we'll be there between 10 and 4. I'm thinking, well, thanks a lot. That just means the whole day. You don't know when you're going to be here. And then maybe at 3:45 they call and say, well, we're sorry, but we can't come till tomorrow. You know how you feel when those things happen. And so today, as we study and look at God's promises and God's predictions, the things that God has done, I think that gives us one of the best defenses to share with people about the hope that we have, because as we notice these things, he's never broken a promise. Everything he said has always come true when he said it would come true. And it happened exactly as he said it was going to do. And so sometimes, you get to looking at these and you're thinking, how can I really convince someone to trust in God? Well, the same way you would get someone to trust in a plumber or an electrician or a car salesman or someone, because they've kept their word and they've delivered what they promised. Shortly after Jesus' resurrection, there were people that were looking for his immediate return. They were thinking Jesus is coming back soon, And so they're looking for that. Some people had just given up, as far as continuing their future and waiting for Jesus to come back. The passage I mentioned in Matthew 24:42, what does Jesus say about his return?
You do not know when he's coming.
Yeah. You don't know. Jesus says, I don't even know, It'll be like a thief in the night. It'll come unannounced. You will have no way of ever knowing that. And yet there's people waiting for that to come imminently. From the year 500 AD, there have been written testimonies of people who have predicted the returning of Christ. They would give a date. In the last 150 years, think of all the predictions that have been out there about the return of Christ. Major religious denominations have been founded because someone said they had gotten a vision from God, and this is when Jesus is going to return, and they convinced all these believers to follow them. And some of those are still in effect today. And what's interesting is when the date would come and Jesus didn't return, well, they got another vision, or they recalculated the time. And so, well, it's going to be here. It's kind of like that contractor that said, well, I can't get there, it'll be tomorrow. Some of them even said that Jesus did come, but he's invisible and he's not showing himself to us. And I'm thinking, if I was Jesus, I wouldn't want to come back here and just hang around, and just be aggravated with what everything was going on. But you think of all those predictions about Jesus returning. In 1975, I looked this up the other day. In 1975, on April 22nd, there was a worldwide seminar, I guess, to speak of. It's grown to nearly 200 countries being involved in this and 20 million people. And it's Earth Day. And they get together, and there are politicians, educators, experts in fields, scientists, activists, and they've all gotten together to share what information they have about the destruction of the earth and what's going to happen. Now, this was the first one, I think, was in 1970 when it kind of started, but 75 it really got promoted, and our government made it a national day to be recognized. But here's some of the things that they came up with in 1975. The end of the earth, or civilization as we know it, would end with a worldwide famine during the 80s. Didn't happen. Life expectancy by 1985 would be limited to 42 years. And in 1985, in urban areas, people would need to wear gas masks because of all of the pollution. Again, in 2000, the world was civilization would end due to worldwide food shortages. And I don't know, maybe just 2000, the change in the millennium brought about all these different things. One expert, I guess, said that by 2000, lead, tin, zinc, gold, and copper would be exhausted. There would be no more on the earth. Also in 2000, the ice age would be upon us, and the earth would be encapsulated in ice. But another group also predicted by 2000 that there would be a massive global warming, and the ice caps would all melt and submerge most of the land mass. Well, 2000, been 23 years, none of these things have happened. And all of the talk even today about global warming and ice ages and shortages and the ozone depletion. I was reading a thing the other day because I'm getting ready to teach this type of material to the high school class the next quarter, and it talked about there are 3 to 5 times more just trees, not plants and grass and other things, but just trees in the world that absorbs the carbon dioxide from what man produces. 3 times more trees than they even need to take care of that, you know. I remember one fella here recently talking in Australia. He said I believe a mangrove tree or whatever in Australia, there are more of those in Australia to offset any kind of pollution that they're making. And he said, but then you tear down the mangrove trees to put up solar panels, which cause more issues and things. And so it's just, all of these experts have all of these things, and they've forgotten what kind of a world God has made. And that doesn't include all of the California mystics and the horoscopes, fortune tellers, and individuals who claim to have insights into the future. And so today, we're going to look at what God says He does and verify that those things happen or not, whether or not we can trust Him. And that's how people come to trust someone. It's on someone's word. It's on what they produce, what comes from what they've said. And so let's get into that and look at these. I'm going to look at the first 3 passages that Taylor has in the book here. The first one's in Isaiah 41, verses 21 through 24. God here is the prosecuting attorney, I guess. And He's calling the defendants, these other false gods, to task. And He says, "Produce your case," says the Lord. "Bring forth your strong arguments," says the King of Jacob. "Let them bring forth and declare unto us what shall happen. Declare the former things what they are, that we may consider them, and know the latter end of them, or show us things to come. Declare the things that are to come hereafter, that we may know that you are gods. Indeed, do good or do evil, that we may anxiously look about and fear together. Behold, you are nothing, and your work amounts to nothing. An abomination is those who follow you." So this first passage, God just calls out these other gods and says, "What are you doing? You know, show us something. You know, you claim to be this. Show me what you can do." And then in Isaiah 46, He offers His own defense. In verses 9 and 10, He says, "Remember the former things long past, for I am God, and there is no other like me, declaring the end from the beginning and from ancient times which have not been done, saying, my purpose will be established, and I will accomplish all my good pleasure." So on one hand, God says, "What have you done? Show me something." And then on the other hand, He says, "Look at what I've done. Look at what I've accomplished." The last passage here is in Deuteronomy 18, and Moses is addressing the nation of Israel, and they're about to go over into the land of promise, and He will be leaving them. He will be dying. And He says, when you get to Mount Ebal and Gerizim, He's going to give them some promises and things to remember. But here in this chapter, or in this section, the people ask Moses to ask God, how do we know if someone is teaching God's will or not? So how are we supposed to know if someone's, since Moses is gone and we have new people coming in, how do we know if they're really teaching God's will? What's God's answer? Wayne?
If it don't come to pass, it's not from God.
Yeah. And when you look through, especially Kings and Chronicles, how many kings' advisors gave instructions to the kings that weren't true at all? They're just making something up because that's what the king wants to hear, or they want to keep their job, you know. And they're prophesying these things that do not happen. And God says, if they're saying things about me and they come true, then they're speaking from me. But if they don't, they're not from me. Understand that. That's how you can tell. Okay, before we get looking at these specific different prophecies and the fulfillment of those. Any thoughts or any questions or comments about looking at God's Word to take care of this? Well, the first one he talks about in the booklet is Nineveh. And there's two prophecies, one by Nahum and one by Zephaniah. Nineveh is the capital of Assyria. Assyria is one of the most well-known fortified capitals at this time in history. It talks here, if you read, I hope you read through all the material, because we're not going to spend the time this morning doing all of that. But you read through the material of what the city was like, and it talked about the fact that it was 7 miles in circumference with an outer wall that was 200 foot thick, moats around it, towers, and think of Jericho. You know, that city was impregnable, and how it was brought down was miraculous. And the same thing is going to happen to Nineveh. In Nahum, in chapter 1, he gives a description of God and telling who God is, what he's capable of doing, what his life is, what he is like. In chapter 1, in verse 4, he says, he rebukes the sea and makes it dry. He dries up all the rivers. In verse 5, mountains quake because of him. Verse 6, who can stand before his indignation? Verse 7, the Lord is good. Verse 9, whatever you devise against the Lord, he will make a complete end of it. So he gives God's credentials to begin with, and he's talking to the Assyrians, to the city of Nineveh. This is the same city that Jonah spoke to, and what happened when Jonah spoke to him and told about God going to destroy them? They repented. They changed. They said, no, not on our watch. We're going to change. Well, Nahum is giving this warning to Assyria, to Nineveh, 20 years before it even happens. And they never change. In chapter 2, he talks about the overthrow of Nineveh and what that's going to look like. And in chapter 3, he says it's going to be destroyed. There's going to be nothing left. And if you looked in the material here, it said that it was in the 1800s before they even knew there was a Nineveh in modern times. And they were doing an excavation and dug down about 35 or 40 feet and found remains of the city. So for however long that would be, I didn't do that math, 2,400 years, nobody even knew where Nineveh was. It was gone. When God says, I'm going to destroy something and it's not going to be there, believe it. Same thing today. If someone tells you they're going to do something and they do it, good or evil, you remember the first passage back in Isaiah, God says, do something good or bad, so that we knew you can do something. But here God brings this about and destroys it. And it's interesting to note that in the part of destroying Nineveh here, God used nature to do that. He brings about a tremendous flood. It floods the Tigris River, which breaks down the walls, destroys the foundation of that huge wall, and they just march in and take it. Kind of like Jericho. The children of Israel weren't going to conquer Jericho by themselves. And Assyria is being destroyed by Babylon, and it's happening because God made it happen. He said, I'm opening the door for you. This is what's going to happen. We're going to look at also not just Nineveh, but Tyre later on in Jerusalem. God is preparing a worldwide destruction in their area, an area-wide destruction with the Babylonians. And Babylon is going to come down and they're going to destroy Assyria first because it's first in the way. Then they're going to come to Jerusalem, Moab, Edom, all these nations around there. But with Nineveh, you've got both Zephaniah and Nahum prophesying to them at the same time. And if you look at Zephaniah's account, he talks about the punishment of Jerusalem first. And then he says, but I'm gonna destroy the Moabites, the Ammonites, Edom, Ethiopia, Nineveh, all of these others. I'm going to destroy them also at the same time. Understand, this is coming. This is going to happen. And then in the 3rd chapter of Zephaniah, God says, but I'm going to bring Israel back. He didn't bring any of the other nations back. He just brought back his nation. And that happened. And again, you look at this, and especially with, again, the founding the city of Nineveh 2,000 years later, this is historically accounted, not just biblically. The Bible gives us an account of how that happened and that was going to happen. But if you look at history, you can go back there and see when those events happened, because historians in those ages recorded it. And so it's all there. Alan?
Zephaniah 2:14 said the flock's going to be there. I had an instructor in college, Farrell Jenkins, and he said, I've been there, I've seen the flocks. You can get online, you can see pictures of what the site looks like today and see shepherds and sheep. It's very interesting because sometimes it says God predicts there's going to be domesticated flocks, and sometimes God says no, there won't be, just wild animals, and it comes true in every case. And how could that just be by accident?
Yeah, sure. Imagine someone says, well, in 20 years Indianapolis will be gone. We're going to destroy that, and it's going to be gone. And deer are just going to roam around there, and rabbits and groundhogs and possums, and there's not going to be any people there, and imagine how people would feel today about that's never going to happen, and that's how I'm sure the Assyrians felt. We live in this fortified city. That's never going to happen. So then it comes to Babylon. You think about the size of Nineveh. It said that Babylon's walls were 14 miles long on each side, 14 miles square. If you stood in the center of Marion and you went to 700 north, 700 south, 700 east, and 700 west, that's clear out past 69. That's on probably past, that's past Sweetser, that's out to Oak Hill. That's how big this city is. This is a huge city with fortifications, and it's impregnable. And you look at what they have just accomplished with destroying every other nation in the Middle East. They've destroyed all of that. And Isaiah prophesies 200 years earlier. He says, Babylon is not only going to be destroyed, but the Persians are going to do it. This is who's going to do it. They know 200 years ahead of time what's going to happen. Imagine our nation at the founding of it, that someone said, well, 200 years from right now, this nation's going to destroy you, And that's, kind of in the headlines of today, but then it kind of ends up, on the back pages or in the classifieds. But as the time gets closer, people are kind of wondering, well, I wonder what's going to happen here. And Babylon is brought down and destroyed. In Jeremiah, before the Babylonians have destroyed Jerusalem, before that is completed, Jeremiah is preaching, and he's in Babylon. I want to look at verse 51, chapter 51 of Jeremiah. And verses 60, 61 through 64. Jeremiah, for the last 3 chapters, has been talking about the destruction of Babylon, how that's going to happen. And beginning in verse 61 of chapter 51, he says, Jeremiah said to Sarai, as soon as you come to Babylon, then see that you recall all these words aloud, and say, you, O Lord, have promised concerning this place to cut it off, so there will be nothing dwelling in it, whether man or beast, but it will be a perpetual desolation. And as soon as you finish reading this scroll, you will tie it to a stone and throw it in the middle of the Euphrates, and say, just so Babylon will sink down and not rise again because of the calamity which I am going to bring upon her, and they will become exhausted. Thus far are the words of Jeremiah. 70 years before it happens, Jeremiah reminds them, this is what's going to happen to you. There's not going to be anything left. And we can read in Daniel where the Persians came in overnight and diverted again, God uses a river. They diverted the river and went in underneath the walls and destroyed the city. A magnificent structure, and it's gone. And God said, I'm telling you, this is what's going to happen because you won't change. And this is what I'm going to do. And so again, you know, when we were building our house and we went to the contractor, I asked him, I said, can you tell me places that you've worked with, that you've done before, so I can go see them? And so we did. We went to 3 or 4 different places that were either in construction or were done to see the work that he did and how the people felt about that. And so I'm verifying this fellow's work. Well, God here is saying, you know, here's some verification of what I can do, what I will do. Phil?
Well, what's interesting is you mentioned about, well, this particular country would going to overthrow the U.S., for instance.
Yeah.
Well, we would think China and Russia
Yeah.
and all that stuff because they're powerful. Well, back in the days, Persia was nothing.
Sure.
So
Yeah.
it would be like us saying, you know, if somebody would say Ghana's going to destroy
Yeah.
us.
Yeah.
You know, and you look at who's Ghana.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
that's the kind of person that ended up overthrowing them. It wasn't some big, huge power.
Sure.
It's somebody that didn't exist as a power at that time. So.
Yeah, and he not only knew that was going to happen, when it was going to happen, who it was going to happen, who was going to do it, but they didn't even, like you say, they didn't even exist at the time. You know, it was like, who are they? Where are they from? You know, we don't even know this nation, and they're going to overthrow us. You know, and it comes to pass and it happens. I was reading an article that said that Babylon, they've tried to rebuild Babylon a couple of times, but never did. The latest one to try to do that was Saddam Hussein. He tried to rebuild Babylon, and it's still a desolation. It's unpopulated and deserted. When God says, I'm going to destroy this, and it's not coming back, it doesn't come back. You use any of our modern technology or whatever. If God said it happened. Alan?
Saddam Hussein, he built a ugly pink palace there. It's all stripped out and graffiti on it out there. It's totally a desolation now. But on every brick of it, he put that he rebuilt Babylon.
Right.
And, you know, what audacity they had to put that on every brick of that structure. That was the inauguration of the rebuilding or whatever, and it didn't get any bigger. But it just had enough to show how he defied God and how it didn't happen.
Yeah. And unless you have someone who's really involved in history, especially a teenager, and you ask them about Saddam Hussein, they're probably like, I don't even know who that is, you know. And we've forgotten him, you know. At least most of the world will have forgotten him, and Babylon is still not there. It's still gone. The next one he talks about is Tyre, and it was similar to Nineveh, predicting that Babylon would destroy that. And those who would try to rebuild it, it was again destroyed several times. The Romans, the Greeks, different groups tried to rebuild that, and they would tear it back down again. And Tyre is a city there today, but the city that was originally there is gone. And it's not there. It's just, it would be like somebody saying, okay, you know, we've got this Key West, you've got this city down here, and it's not there anymore. It's gone. You know, the land is there, but there's nothing there. There's no people there. The land may still be there, but everything else is just gone. And then finally, Jerusalem. And this was the passage I mentioned earlier in Deuteronomy 27 and 28. God is telling the people through Moses to go to Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal. And he said, I'm going to there present curses and blessings. If you do, it's an if-then situation. If you do this, then this is what will happen. If you do this, then this is what will happen. So he tells them what's going to happen And sadly, they fail to keep what God had told them to do, and Babylon will destroy them. 900 years later is when this happens. And God didn't set a timeline. He just said, when you do this, this is when I'm going to react. And he said, just know that's going to happen. And you look at all the prophets who prophesied to Jerusalem, to the kings, and said, God said this is what's going to happen. He's going to do it. You think that you're God's people. And again, God didn't destroy all the people. He destroyed the city. Because he said, I'm going to bring people back to re-inhabit this. And they're going to come back to that. 2 times the Bible talks about the destruction of Jerusalem. Both times it happens, both times it's recorded in history. The second time, in Matthew 24, Jesus talks about Jerusalem's going to be destroyed again. In less than 40 years, it's going to be destroyed again. And they knew it was coming. And he's telling them, he said, look for these things. When you see this, do what? Yeah, get out of town. Don't stay here, because I'm going to destroy this city. You need to leave. And Jerusalem was destroyed, and even more so, the nation of Israel as a nation was destroyed as far as genealogy. The people today have no idea what tribe, because they destroyed all the records. Everything was gone. And Jesus says this is going to happen. And all of these predictions that we've looked at have been historically verified by accounts other than the Bible. You don't have to look at the Bible to see this. Just get on Wikipedia. Even the internet will tell you that's what happened. They may not tell you, about God's prophecy about it, but they will tell you that this is what happened. And we can look back and say, I know how that happened. I know why that happened. There's so many answers that we have, as Taylor's already talked about with creation. There's questions people have about the creation, about our earth, and they have no answers for them. Well, we have the answers. We know what they are. They're right here, And here's the result of what those answers are. So what are some other prophecies that you can think of that have been fulfilled? That are verifiable? Lois? Absolutely. That was the one that I really liked. In Jeremiah said that the captivity in Babylon would last how long? 70 years. And Isaiah tells us who's going to let them go? The king of another country. Isaiah tells us that 100 to 150 years before it happens. You think of somebody 150 years ago saying, okay, I'm going to do this, and this is the person that's going to do that. Another person who wasn't even alive. He wasn't even a thought in somebody's mind. This is 150 years before the event, and he says this person is going to allow them to leave captivity. And that accounting's there. And I can't help but think that Cyrus knew that. That Cyrus probably had information, had the writings of the prophets, and somebody pointed it out and said, hey, Cyrus, did you see you're in their writings from 150 years ago? And it happened. So there's certainly one prophecy that was, amazing to the person. What's some others? Think of, Alan?
Well, Ezekiel also tells about the diminishing of Egypt, which is really interesting because, they're no power at all, but they had, the pyramids and King Tut and all the riches and pharaohs for thousands of years, and we're still in that position when Ezekiel said that, but he said they're going to be like the lowliest of nations, and who would have thought that then?
Sure. But
we know it now, and that the now canals would dry up, causing that to happen. And 96% of Egypt is desert today. But it was a flourishing, fertile land when Ezekiel was talking about it. And just quite amazing.
Yeah. And Egypt's still a well-known historical nation today, but nothing like it was then. Nothing. Wayne?
The prophecy of the destruction of Edom, and then the destruction of Edom.
Sure. And again, cities that were impregnable, and people said, who's ever going to destroy this? If you've seen pictures of Edom, that's a natural, magnificent city. And God says, you think you live up there and, eagles can't even get you. He says, I can get you. And he does, and they're nothing, they're not there. I think about in 2 Kings 20, he told Hezekiah he was going to die, and God said, okay, I'll give you 15 more years. And he gave him 15 more years. A simple prophecy that didn't necessarily cover nations. Probably the only bad aspect of allowing Hezekiah to live for 15 more years was he had a son named Manasseh during that time, and he was the worst of the kings. But anyway, even that. Think about the flood. God predicted a flood. Most every civilization has talked about the flood in some sort or another. They talk about that. God predicted that maybe 100 years before it happened. Noah's got to build the ark and get that ready, and God's collecting all the animals, but he predicted that he was going to destroy the earth with water. And it happened. And there's evidence today that people try to dispute, but there's no other answer for it than the fact of a catastrophic flooding. Thinking about all these different things and looking at that, and this is God's resume. And he says, here's what I've done. You can trust me. Wayne?
Well, of course, the most of all was all the prophecies of Christ that just in the nation of Israel being preserved for that reason, even though of their extreme wickedness at all times. God preserved them, but then when it came to that final destruction of Jerusalem, they had refused the Christ and it was over. And the fact that it was over, even though they keep trying and trying and trying to rebuild, it's not there because God's not there.
Yeah. And it doesn't matter how many peace accords and things there are going on. People try to bring about peace in the Middle East among those nations. They've never been at peace since Israel moved into the land. It's always been in turmoil. It always has, and it's not going to change. And as Wayne says, God destroyed Jerusalem. To say I'm done with this. I would think most of the United States politically would align with Israel and say, well, they're God's people and all of this. Well, they're not. We are God's people. And Jesus and the apostles taught that over and over, that those who are Abraham's children spiritually are God's people, not physically. The physical has nothing to do with it anymore. And God destroyed Jerusalem to remove the physical. They've got movies about, the Raiders of the Lost Ark and finding the ark and finding the cross and finding the chalice Jesus drank out, or, movies, makes for good things. God destroyed that. That's not going to be left. It's not going to be there. And so as we began today, I brought out, the idea of trusting in individuals or businesses based on their word and on promises that they kept. Again, I think this is one of the reasons why when people ask us about our faith, is to say, look at all the things here that have happened. And especially next week, when you look at the prophecies Jesus fulfilled, and so many of those, he couldn't have had anything to do with that, because he either wasn't born or he had died. And prophecies about him are still coming true. And so when you put all those together, and God says, here's my resume, you can trust me. When I say this, believe it, and I will do what I say. Good or bad, if you do this, then I'll do this. And so we can have that faith in him, that the promises he's made, he's going to keep. How many, I think we've already looked at these passages where it says, you think about for God, nothing is impossible. But there's one thing that's impossible for God to do. Lie. God doesn't lie. He tells us the truth. We may not want to hear it, but he tells us the truth. He's straight up. When Jesus was doing his ministry and people wanted to be his disciples, he said, you got to understand, this goes with it. Realize what's going to be involved in this. I want you to come. I beg you to come, but understand, this is how it's going to be, Phil.
Another thing that we hadn't brought up yet was the prophecy in Daniel 2 about the four kings.
Sure.
And we talked about the kingdoms being destroyed, but God did it. But it was in Babylon, and then there's going to be Persia and Assyria, and you talk about Rome. But,
Yeah.
and then even the fine details that were in there, this guy's going to desecrate the temple, and
Yeah.
there's going to be feet of clay and all this, and where the kingdom was broken up.
Yeah.
It's just when you study that, it's just
Yeah.
wow.
And Greece and Rome weren't even nations at the time, They're not even there. And yet he's predicting, what's going to happen with that. Artie?
I hear people say, well, how can God be cruel to do this and stuff? How cruel is it when he actually tells you what to do
Yeah.
so things like that won't happen?
Yeah.
So now the burden of proof is on you. So you have to, or not burden of proof, burden of following through
Yeah.
is on you. Because he has given us a way.
Yeah.
But people, they don't want to follow it, so the easiest thing to do rather than accept the burden himself is to blame God.
Yeah. And how foolish do we see it is when someone blames, I can't think of the name, Panasonic. Someone sues Panasonic because they took a shower with their hairdryer. And says, it says right on here, do not use this in the shower, and you do, and you electrocute yourself. And so we're going to sue them because, how could they do something like this? Well, they gave you the instructions, you can't fix dumb, Understand this, it's not the manufacturer's fault. The gal that sues McDonald's because she spilled hot coffee on herself. Come on, it's hot coffee, Just don't drive and drink anything. But like you say, we do that with God. Well, how could God do this? He put warnings on these things and told us, if you do this, this is what's going to happen. If you're a fair-skinned person like me, and if I go out and spend the day outside with nothing on my ears, they're going to burn to a crisp and peel and hurt. I know that, and who do I want to blame that on? The blame falls on me because I didn't listen to the instruction, and so here with God's word, and I think that's an excellent point, Artie, is we blame God, but it's like blaming the manufacturer when we don't use a product correctly. It's not the manufacturer's fault, So he's given us all these instructions, all this evidence, all this information, and so he says, when you talk to people about me, tell them what I've done. Show them what I've done. And that will help them believe and help your belief, because I've done exactly what I said I was going to do. And you trust someone like that, and you respect them, you appreciate them, even if it hurts. I know our kids have come back and told us, they said, well, we really didn't like the way you did some things, but you were right. Because we had that foreknowledge and would warn them about things, and now they understand them. And so hopefully this has helped, and then next week as we continue with that, Taylor can expound on all the prophecies that are filled about Jesus, which are a whole lot more than we looked at today. So thank you for your attention.